My name is Chloe, and this is the story of how my life was turned upside down not once, but twice. I think I should start from the beginning. I was born into a family of loving parents, Mark and Lisa Smith, in a small suburban town where everyone knew each other by name, when neighbors dropped in uninvited for a cup of coffee, and the streets were filled with the voices of children playing in the evenings. My parents weren't rich. My dad worked as a journalist, my mom was a nurse at a local hospital, but our house always had a warm, cozy atmosphere filled with the smell of homemade cakes, laughter, and light bickering, which is inevitable in every family. Life was calm and measured, but just one moment changed it forever. I was 12 when something happened that divided my life into before and after. It was a rainy Tuesday evening in autumn. My parents went to a dinner party with friends, and I stayed at home with my grandmother. We were sitting in the living room, and I was lazily watching some silly cartoon, while Grandma was knitting, muttering softly to herself something like, "There's nothing worthwhile on TV again." I was just nodding off when the phone rang. It sounded alarmingly loud in the silence of the house. Grandma got up, slowly went to the phone, picked up the receiver, and although I did not hear the words of the interlocutor, I saw how her face first fell, then turned pale, and tears glistened in her eyes. She pressed her lips together, closed her eyes, and then, abruptly turning away, covered her mouth with her hand, but I still heard a strangled sob. A chill ran down my spine. The next few days passed in a blur. I remember someone saying, "Lisa." Lisa did not survive. I remember jerky phrases about some drunk driver, about a terrible collision on a wet road, that my father survived, but is in serious condition. I didn't understand what it all meant. I couldn't realize that my mother would no longer return home, that her smile would no longer light up our morning, that she would no longer cuddle me before going to bed. I was allowed to see my dad only a few days after the accident, when his condition had stabilized a little. I remember that hospital room, the white walls, the smell of antiseptic, the hum of appliances, the faint glow of a night light. And his. Lying on the bed, haggard, pale, looking 10 years older. His eyes were filled with so much pain and guilt that I wanted to scream, "Dad, it's not your fault," but I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat. He looked at me, slowly raised his hand, extended his palm to me, and when I took his hand, he squeezed my fingers weakly. "Chloe." His voice was hoarse, weak. "I'm so sorry, honey. So sorry." I didn't understand why he was apologizing, because it wasn't his fault. How could he have done anything to stop that man who got behind the wheel in a drunken state? But years later, I realized that he wasn't apologizing for the accident itself, but for how our lives had changed after it. For the pain I had to go through. For himself, for feeling helpless. But Mark Smith was not one to give up. Despite the fact that his legs were crushed and doctors said he would never be able to walk again, he did not let it break him. As soon as he was discharged from the hospital, he fully focused on his work. He has always been a talented journalist, but now his articles have become deeper, sharper, filled not just with facts, but with real emotions. He got a job as an editor at the main city newspaper and worked tirelessly. When I became a teenager, he did everything possible to keep my life as normal as possible. He encouraged me to participate in school clubs, meet new people, go to events, but to be honest, I preferred to spend time with him. We often watched old movies together, argued about books, and discussed the news. He helped me with my homework, patiently explaining mathematics, although he preferred literature more. When it was time to go to college, he said, "You need to spread your wings, kid. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine." I wasn't sure, I didn't want to leave him alone, but I knew he was right. I enrolled in a state university with a degree in accounting, and it was there that I met my future best friend, Jessica. Jessica was incredible, confident, energetic, with an infectious laugh, and it was thanks to her that I met her second cousin Michael. He was kind, funny, and easy to talk to, and when I told him about my father, he didn't get embarrassed, didn't start saying trivial words of sympathy, but just accepted it as a part of my life. When he first met Dad, they immediately found a common language. They both loved classic rock and could spend hours discussing their favorite bands. "Your old man is cool," Michael told me one day when we were returning from Dad's. "And you're amazing to have taken care of him all these years." I shrugged my shoulders, but a warm feeling spread inside me that maybe, just maybe, I really could have had a normal life. A life where there is love, joy, laughter, and, perhaps, your own family. I got a job at the local tax office. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it was stable, and most importantly, it allowed me to provide for myself and help my father, while Michael started working as a trucker, often went on flights and could be absent for several days in a row. We dated for 2 years before he proposed to me, choosing a special moment for this, a cool autumn evening, the park where our first date took place, when the leaves swirled in the air, scattering like a golden carpet underfoot, and a light breeze brought the smell of ripe foliage and something sweet from the nearest cafe. He got down on one knee right there in the alley, illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns. His eyes shone with love, and in his hand he held a ring with a small but delicate pearl. I was happy, immensely happy, but at the same time I realized that there was one thing that I needed to clarify. "Yes, Michael," I whispered, barely holding back tears of joy, "but I can't leave Dad. He needs me." Michael's face broke into a wide, warm smile. There was not a shadow of doubt in his eyes, not a drop of disappointment. "I wouldn't want it to be any other way," he said, taking my hands. "We're all going to live together. Your dad's apartment is big enough for the 3 of us, right?" My chest filled with such relief and gratitude that I threw my arms around his neck, feeling dizzy with happiness. The wedding was modest, but incredibly beautiful. We didn't want lavish celebrations, and my father insisted on walking me down the aisle, and despite his condition, he did it sitting in his wheelchair, with his head held high. No one in the house had dry eyes that day. I stood holding Michael's hand, feeling like the heroine of a fairy tale, but like in any fairy tale, villains were supposed to appear in this one, and their faces turned out to be familiar. From the first moment I met his family, I realized that neither his mother, Karen, nor his sister, Emily, approved of me. They didn't even try to hide their contempt. It literally flowed in their voices, looks, and every emphatically polite but barbed word. "So your father is disabled?" Karen asked during our first acquaintance, wrinkling her nose as if she smelled something unpleasant. "He's an invalid," I corrected her, trying to keep my tone calm and neutral. "But he works as an editor at the city newspaper." "And she's so sweet," Karen drawled, clearly not interested in the details. Then she turned to her son, her lips forming a thin line. "Michael, darling, are you sure about this? There are so many good girls from good families." I felt the blood rush to my face, burning my skin with anger and humiliation, but before I could say anything, Michael stepped forward. "Mom, Chloe comes from a good family, and her father's disability doesn't change anything. I love her, and that's all that matters." Karen pressed her lips together, but said nothing, although disappointment was clearly visible in her eyes. Emily, as if following her mother's example, was cold and aloof, as if she considered me beneath their dignity. After the wedding, Michael kept his word and moved in with my father and me. Life gradually settled into a familiar routine. I went to work at the tax office, Michael went on flights, and in the evenings, when he was at home, the 3 of us had dinner, talked, watched movies, and discussed the news. Everything was fine until Karen and Emily came to our house. In their presence, the air seemed to thicken, become heavy, tense. They walked around the apartment as if they owned the place and their father didn't exist for them, and they barely nodded at him, if at all. One day, passing by the kitchen, I heard their muffled conversation. "What a pity," Karen said softly, but loud enough for me to hear. "Michael could have done much more. And now he's stuck with this girl and her crippled father." "And if they have children," Emily chimed in with a disgusted laugh, "can you imagine those genes?" I froze, feeling a wave of rage rise inside me, but at that moment I just clenched my fists and bit my tongue. For Michael's sake. For the sake of family peace. But it was getting harder to endure. One day, after a particularly intense visit from Karen and Emily, I couldn't stand it and burst into tears as soon as I closed the door behind them. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, fists clenched, sobbing into the pillow when Michael entered the room. He immediately came up to me, sat down next to me, hugged me, pulling me to him. "Hey, hey," he said softly, hugging me to his chest. "What happened?" "They hate me," I sobbed. "They think I'm not good enough for you, because of Dad." Michael's face hardened, and his eyes darkened with anger. "This is ridiculous," he said firmly. "You and your father are my family now. If they can't accept it, that's their problem, not ours." His words were comforting, but inside I couldn't help feeling that this was just the beginning of our problems with Karen and Emily. As the months passed, Michael's trucking business began to flourish. Orders came in one after another, and he practically did not get out of his truck, driving around the country, transporting goods from one end to the other. I missed him terribly when he was away, especially on long evenings when the house was silent, broken only by the muted hum of the TV, which Dad seemed to pay less attention to than his thoughts. But I tried not to get discouraged. I immersed myself in my work, dealing with reports, documents, tax returns, and in the evenings I kept Dad company, reading newspaper articles aloud to him or just discussing the day. On one of those autumn evenings, when the air was fresh and clear, and the dead leaves were slowly falling off, rustling under my feet, I helped my father get into bed, straightening the blanket and covering him with a blanket, when the phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and as I lifted the phone to my ear, I immediately detected an unusual excitement in his voice. His words sounded fast, agitated, as if he could barely contain his impatience. "Chloe, I've been thinking," he began, and I immediately sensed that he was about to say something important. "What would you say if we bought a townhouse?" I frowned at the unexpected suggestion, but before I could respond, he continued. "It would be more convenient for your father. It would make it easier for him to move around in a wheelchair. He could spend more time outside. And we would also have a garden. You could do it when I'm not around. It's great, right?" I stole a glance at Dad, who seemed to be trying to keep a straight face, but I noticed how his fingers on the blanket tightened slightly, betraying inner excitement. "Dad, what do you think?" I asked, turning on the speakerphone. My father looked at me, then looked at the phone and after a short pause nodded. "A garden, that would be good," he confessed, and there was a note of hope in his voice. "And it would be easier to go outside." That solved everything. In the following weeks, we immersed ourselves in the search for a suitable house, looked through dozens of ads, went to viewings, compared prices, layouts, and tried to imagine what our future life would be like. In the end, we found the perfect option: a spacious townhouse with wide doorways, a comfortable shower with handrails for Dad, and a cozy backyard, where I already imagined flower beds and beds of greenery. Taking out a mortgage was scary. It seemed like a huge responsibility, but with Michael's income, my contribution, and the opportunity to rent out my father's old apartment, we were able to sort everything out. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon in the spring when we finally moved our things and officially became the owners of the new house. I will never forget the look on Dad's face when he first went out onto the terrace, looked around the spacious patio, took a deep breath of fresh air and said softly, "It's perfect, honey." "Thank you." I noticed how his eyes sparkled, and I felt warm from the realization that we had made the right choice. In the following months, we settled in, filling the house with comfort. I planted a small vegetable garden, and Dad sat outside for a long time, enjoying the sun and peace. It was our perfect, quiet happiness, our little idol. And then it was housewarming time. We invited friends and colleagues, and, of course, despite all the past insults, we decided to invite Karen and Emily. The party was in full swing. The guests were talking, laughing, enjoying the food, and I felt completely happy until I saw Karen and Emily enter the house. As always, they arrived late and from the very first minutes began to look around with a scrutinizing look, as if they were assessing every corner, assessing what did not concern them. Karen strolled around the house, looking at the surroundings with barely concealed curiosity, as if she were writing down everything she didn't like in her mind. I could see the gears turning in her head, her lips moving as if she was about to say something, but she was still trying to find the right words. When we reached the master bedroom, she suddenly stopped, turned to me, and gave me a light, almost friendly smile that seemed fake to me. "You know, Chloe," she began in a low, confidential voice, "this place would be perfect for Michael and me." I frowned, not understanding what she was getting at. "Why don't you send your dad to a nursing home? And then I could move here," she continued, looking at me as if she was offering something completely reasonable. I felt my legs give out. "I'm sorry, what?" "Oh, don't look at me like that," Karen said, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Your father is not healthy. He is no longer a full-fledged person, isn't he? He doesn't need all this. Such a luxury is unnecessary for him. A nursing home is more than a decent option for a person in his condition." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A lump rose in my throat, a wave of rage rose in my chest, but before I could answer, Karen turned around and, as if nothing had happened, went out onto the terrace, where Dad was chatting with the guests. To my horror, Karen grabbed the handles of my father's wheelchair and, before I could react, began pushing him towards the driveway, her steps fast, determined, and her expression cold and impassive, as if she was doing some mundane job, as if it were something which required no discussion or resolution. "Karen!" I screamed, rushing after her, my heart pounding in my chest with a mixture of rage and horror. "What are you doing?" She didn't even stop, continuing to push my father, and when she spoke, there was that condescending, smug note in her voice that always made me clench my fists. "If he doesn't want to go to the nursing home," she said casually, as if discussing furniture that could be rearranged at will, "he can stay outside. Isn't that what you wanted? So that he spends more time outdoors?" I was shaking with rage and impotence. It seemed to me that if I didn't stop her right now, she would really take him to a place where we couldn't pick him up anymore. "Leave him alone." It escaped my lips, but before I could grab her hand and stop her, I heard the sound of rapid footsteps, and the next second Michael ran up to us. He obviously heard the noise and ran out of the house. His face was red with anger, his jaw was clenched, his eyes were burning with rage. "Mom!" he shouted so loudly that Karen froze. "What are you doing? Let go of Mark's chair right now." Karen turned around, her face contorted with surprise, as if she really didn't understand what the problem was, as if her actions were completely normal. "But, darling," she began, but Michael wasn't going to listen anymore. "I don't want to hear it." His voice was booming, there was such fury in it that for a moment I was even afraid that he would just kick her out of the house right now. "You and Emily have to leave. Immediately." Karen stood for a few seconds, opening and closing her mouth, as if trying to find the words, but apparently realizing that Michael wasn't joking, she abruptly turned around and, without even giving a parting glance, headed for the exit. Emily followed her, snorting under her breath, but I didn't even try to hear her. After they left, there was a tense silence in the house. Michael turned to my father and me, his shoulders slumped, his face softened, he looked devastated, broken. "I'm so sorry," he finally managed, his voice shaking. I had no idea she could do something like that. "I'm just so sorry." Dad reached out and patted him on the palm, his face was calm, there was understanding in his eyes. "It's not your fault, son," he said softly. "It's just that there are people who can't understand." After that incident, Karen and Emily kept their distance, which was fine with me. Michael, trying to drown out his worries, threw himself into work, took on more long-haul flights to help cover the mortgage, and I continued to divide my time between the tax office, the house, and taking care of Dad. So 2 years flew by, which seemed like an instant. Our lives settled into a familiar routine. Dad spent his days in the garden, taking care of plants, working on articles that he edited from home, and every evening after work I told him how the day had gone. We drank tea on the terrace, enjoying the peace and stability. Michael would come home for a few days and then leave again, and even though his absence depressed me, I tried not to complain, realizing that he was doing this for us. But one day this familiar world collapsed. I was at work when my phone rang. I answered automatically without even looking at the screen, but as soon as I heard an unfamiliar male voice, my heart sank. "Mrs. Thompson?" "What is it?" the voice on the other end of the line asked. Yes, my voice trembled. Intuition told me that now I was going to hear something terrible. "This is Officer Rodriguez from the traffic police," the man said. My heart sank. "Yes?" I barely managed, clutching the phone so that my knuckles turned white. "I'm sorry to inform you that your husband, Michael Thompson, was in a serious accident." The rest of the conversation was a blur. Some words, "head-on collision," "did not survive," flashed through my head, but I could not comprehend them. I could not allow myself to believe it. It couldn't be true. It just couldn't happen. It wasn't until I heard myself thanking the officer and hanging up the phone that reality began to sink in. Michael is gone. The next week was shrouded in a haze of grief, emptiness, and disbelief. I moved like a robot, mechanically making decisions, filling out paperwork, organizing funerals, barely realizing what was happening. Dad was there, but even his presence couldn't ease the pain that shot through me with every breath. The day before the funeral, I gathered my strength and dialed Karen's number. I knew she deserved to hear the news from me, not from a newspaper obituary or someone else's mouth. "Hello?" Her sharp voice rang out. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady, but my voice was shaking anyway. "Karen, this is Chloe," I said. "It's about Michael. He's gone. An accident has occurred." There was silence on the other end of the line. And then, to my amazement, her voice returned, but there was no grief, no tears, just venom. "It's your fault," she hissed. "You made him work so hard. You made him travel to pay for this house. You killed my son." I froze, feeling a chill run through my body, clutching my heart with icy fingers. "Karen," I gasped in disbelief. "Don't you dare make excuses," she interrupted. "I expect you to give him the best funeral you can buy, but don't expect a penny from us. You made your bed yourself, now lie in it." There was a sharp click, and the line ended. I remained standing, clutching the phone, tears streaming down my cheeks. How could she be so cruel? How could she blame me for that? The day of Michael's funeral turned out to be gray and drizzling, as if nature itself was grieving with me, as if the clouds had absorbed all my pain and were now pouring down in a quiet, cold rain, perfectly reflecting the emptiness that had settled in my heart. The church was packed. Michael was loved and respected by many, and it seemed like half the city had come to pay their last respects to him. Colleagues, friends, truckers with whom he worked, even those with whom he crossed paths only by chance, all stood, listened to the service, bowing their heads, expressing condolences. Someone whispered kind words, someone just squeezed my hand, but all this passed by me as if through a thick fog. I felt like an empty shell with ice inside. But what struck me the most was not even how many people came, but who wasn't there. Neither Karen nor Emily showed up for the funeral. Not a single glance, not a single tear, not a single sign that they even realized that they had lost their son and brother. They didn't even bother to show their face, as if it didn't concern them at all. Michael's father, an elderly man with gray temples and sad eyes, stood next to me, watching me. At one point, when people were passing by expressing their condolences, he held out his hand to me, squeezed it with his trembling fingers and said softly but firmly, "Their loss, dear. We're a family, and we'll get through this together." Those words were the last warm ray of light in this cold, heartless day. After the funeral, Dad and I returned home. It had been a long, tiring day, and the fog in my head hadn't cleared, but when our car turned into the driveway, something seemed strange to me. The lights were on in the house. I was absolutely sure that I had turned everything off before I left. "Did you leave the light on, Dad?" I asked, frowning, but he just shook his head. An uneasy premonition squeezed my heart with icy fingers. As we got closer, I saw movement behind the curtains. My heart started pounding, my thoughts racing. A robbery? On the day of Michael's funeral? Is someone that soulless? I helped Dad out of the car, put him in a wheelchair, and I began to frantically think about whether to call the police right away or look inside first. But before I could make a decision, I heard familiar voices. My blood froze in my veins when I realized whose voices they were. I opened the door and saw Karen and Emily standing right in the middle of our living room, surrounded by boxes, furniture, and things scattered everywhere. What the hell is going on here? My voice was filled with such anger that for a moment even my grief receded, overshadowed by outrage at this unheard of intrusion. Karen turned around, her face instantly assuming a mask of false sympathy, the one that always made me want to scream. "Oh, Chloe, dear," she said in a voice full of mock regret. "We're just helping you pack up, because you can't afford to run this place now that Michael's gone." I froze in disbelief. Emily screamed in her sickeningly sweet voice. "Don't worry, you can always go back to your dad's apartment. It's cozy, you'll be fine there." I felt rage building up inside me, a dark, burning fire burning away the remnants of the tears I had already shed, drowning the ice that enveloped my heart. "Get out." My voice was low and steady, but there was a threat in it, and judging by the way Emily instinctively recoiled, she felt it. "Get out of my house. Right now." Karen dared to look offended. "This house belongs to us now," she said coldly. "This is Michael's property. We're his family, after all." Something broke in me. Family? I exploded, feeling myself literally shaking with indignation. Where were you today when we said goodbye to him? Where were you at the funeral? Oh, right, you didn't even bother to show up. Karen waved her hand dismissively, as if brushing away an annoying insect. "We've been busy making preparations." Her voice was lazy, arrogant. "Now be a good girl and start packing. We'll meet tomorrow." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. These women didn't shed a single tear for Michael, didn't even come to his funeral, but now they were standing in my house, among my things, and telling me to leave. "I'm calling the police." I pulled out my phone and pressed the call button. Karen and Emily looked at each other, and a shadow of concern flashed across their faces. They obviously didn't expect me to resist. "Chloe," Karen began, but I cut her off. "No. You have 5 minutes to get out of my house before the cops arrive. This is my home. Michael and I bought it together. You have no right to be here." Maybe it was the steel in my voice, or the fire in my eyes, but Karen and Emily finally realized they had gone too far. They packed up their things and left, but not before Karen stopped in the doorway, threw her contemptuous smile at me and said, "It's not over yet, Chloe. You'll hear from our lawyers." The days after Michael's funeral merged into one endless, agonizing canvas of grief, anxiety, and oppressive emptiness, in which there was no place for joy or even simple relief. I felt crushed, broken, as if the whole world had collapsed around me, leaving only the ruins of our past life, which I now wandered through, not knowing how to move on. I tried to find solace in my affairs, plunging headlong into settling all the formalities related to Michael's death. I filled out paperwork, dealt with bank accounts, talked with insurance companies and lawyers, just not to be left alone with this overwhelming sense of loss. But deep down, I knew that all this was not only an attempt to occupy myself with something, but also the fear of the inevitable, The fear that Karen and Emily would not stop and make another attempt to take away my house, money, everything that Michael and I had built together. It was a week after the funeral when my phone rang and an unknown number appeared on the screen. My heart skipped a beat and then started beating faster when I held the phone to my ear, fearing that Karen was carrying out her threat and starting legal proceedings against me. "Mrs. Thompson?" A clear, professional voice rang out. "Yes, it's me," I replied, feeling my palms break out in cold sweat. "This is James Anderson from Anderson and Partners. I'm calling about your late husband's will." I blinked, trying to process his words. "A will? A will?" I asked, trying to remember if Michael had ever said something like that, but all I could think about was emptiness. "Yes, ma'am," the lawyer confirmed. "Mr. Thompson came to us about 6 months ago. He asked us to contact you in the event of his death." I felt a glimmer of hope, but at the same time I was perplexed. Why didn't Michael tell me about this? What does it mean? What did he know or feel if he decided to take care of such a thing in advance? I made an appointment the next day, but the night before that, I barely slept, tossing and turning in bed, replaying all sorts of scenarios in my head. The next morning, I took my dad with me and together we went to Mr. Anderson's office. The lawyer turned out to be an elderly man with a kind face, on which there were deep wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, betraying his tendency to smile, but today his gaze was serious, sympathetic, but at the same time businesslike. "Mrs. Thompson." "Mr. Smith." "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for us to sit in front of his desk. "I am very sorry for your loss." He opened a thin folder, spread out several documents in front of him, and picked up one of them. "As I said on the phone, your husband came to us to make a will. He made his wishes very clear." I held my breath as Mr. Anderson began to read. "I, Michael Thompson, being of sound mind, hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions to my beloved wife, Chloe Thompson." I gasped, and Dad squeezed my hand tightly. "That includes our house, my truck, and all our savings. I would like Chloe to use these resources to take care of herself and her father, Mark Smith, whom I loved like a family." Tears involuntarily flowed down my face. Even from the grave, Michael continued to take care of us, thought about us, protected us. But the lawyer wasn't done yet. "And that's not all," he said softly, reaching for the envelope and handing it to me. "Mr. Thompson left a letter for you." I took the envelope with shaking hands, carefully opened it, unfolded the paper and began to read. "My dear Chloe, if you're reading this letter, then I'm gone. I'm so sorry that I left you and Mark. Please know that you two were the best thing that ever happened to me. I made this will because I know what my mother and sister can be like. I didn't want to bother you earlier, but I needed to make sure that you and Mark were protected if something happened to me. You are my real family, Chloe. You and Mark. Not them. Take care of each other, live life to the fullest, and know that I will always look out for you. All my love, Michael." I clutched the letter to my chest, feeling my body shake with sobs. Dad couldn't hold back his tears either. His weather-beaten hand lay on top of mine, squeezing it with such force, as if he was afraid that I would crumble right here in this office. Mr. Anderson gave us a minute to recover before he spoke again. "Mrs. Thompson, there's something else." I looked up, not understanding what he meant. "Your husband's truck was insured, and given the circumstances of the accident, the insurance company will pay you the full amount of the policy." I sniffed, trying to put my thoughts together. "What does that mean?" Mr. Anderson smiled slightly. "This means that you will receive a significant amount, sufficient to pay off your mortgage in full, and even more." I exhaled sharply, feeling a weight that I hadn't even fully realized was being lifted off my shoulders. "We'll be fine. Michael took care of it." When Dad and I left the lawyer's office, it seemed to me that I could finally breathe. As our car turned into the driveway, I looked at our house, at the walls that Michael and I had chosen, at the windows that he wanted so much to let in more light, at the courtyard in which he dreamed of planting apple trees. This is our home. And now, thanks to Michael, no one can take him away from us. I noticed a familiar car parked on the street, and my heart skipped a beat, clenched in painful anticipation, barely coping with the recent tension, and now preparing to fight again. This elegant sedan, polished to a high gloss, looked immaculate as always, as if its owner couldn't stand the slightest carelessness even in such small things. "Oh, no," I muttered when I saw Karen and Emily waiting for us on the porch. But this time there was no fear in me. I felt Michael's letter in my pocket, and his words, soaked with care and love, seemed to strengthen me from the inside, giving me strength that I had lacked so much before. He protected us when I didn't even know I needed protection. "Chloe," Karen began as we approached. Her voice was sickeningly sweet, like an overdose of honey hiding something sour and unpleasant. "We need to talk about Michael's estate." I stopped, proudly looking straight into her eyes, without blinking, without retreating, feeling for the first time that I owed her nothing, neither to explain nor to justify myself. "No, Karen." My words sounded confident, clear, without the slightest tremor. "We have nothing to talk about. Michael left everything to me. This is legal, officially, and confirmed by a lawyer. And do you know why? Because we were his real family. Not you." Karen opened her mouth, but this time she was speechless. Emily, who was standing a little behind her, tugged on her mother's arm, whispering urgently in her ear. Karen narrowed her eyes and gave me a venomous look full of contempt, but she didn't say another word. They turned around, got into the car, slammed the doors, and the engine purred before their sedan sped away, leaving me and Dad at our house. The weeks after our meeting with the lawyer passed in a whirlwind of events. I threw myself into Michael's business because it was the only thing that allowed me to stay afloat without sliding back into the swamp of grief and emptiness that filled me with his passing. The insurance payment was received, and as promised by Mr. Anderson, it turned out to be more than enough. We paid off the mortgage in full, relieving ourselves of the debt burden that hung over us, and the balance allowed us not to worry about money for a while. One afternoon, while sorting through Michael's things, I came across his small notebook lying among the papers on his desk. I ran my fingers over the worn cover, feeling warm, as if he'd just held it in his hands. I slowly opened it and saw the pages covered with his uneven, hasty handwriting. It was a kind of diary full of his thoughts, plans, dreams, those things that he might not have said out loud, but which were important to him. I started reading, and my heart sank. He was thinking about the future. About us. About the family. "I want to make sure that our future children will have the best start in life. Maybe we should create a foundation for the college. The main thing is that they have everything that I didn't have." I felt a lump rise in my throat. We were talking about children. We dreamed about them. But we kept putting it off, deciding that first we needed to get back on our feet, stabilize our finances, sort out our home, work, and all the adult problems that seemed so important to us. And now that future is gone. I clutched the notebook in my hands, hugged it to my chest, and whispered through my tears, "Oh, Michael. We had so many plans." That night, I tossed and turned for a long time, unable to sleep. My thoughts revolved around diary entries, unfulfilled dreams, and a lost future that never happened. When I finally dozed off, I dreamed about Michael. He was smiling, and his face was the same as I remembered, soft, kind, and glowing with love, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes, as if he wanted to tell me something important. "It's okay, Chloe." His voice was so calm, so confident. I wanted to tell him that nothing was okay, that I missed him every second, that it hurt so much, but he just held out his hand to me, and there was more to that gesture than just saying goodbye. It was a blessing. The next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling, not exactly relief, but as if something inside me had shifted. I couldn't tell what exactly had changed, but there was something different inside. I got up and started getting ready for work, and suddenly I was overcome by a sharp wave of nausea. I barely made it to the bathroom, cowering by the toilet, breathing heavily, trying to figure out what it was: stress? Fatigue? Hunger? But as the days passed, the nausea did not go away. At first, I attributed it to nerves, tension, and grief, but a small voice in the back of my mind whispered to me another possibility. I waved it off, telling myself that it was impossible. But one day, a week later, I found myself in a pharmacy, standing in front of shelves of pregnancy tests, unable to bring myself to reach out and take one. But I took it. I bought it, returned home, locked myself in the bathroom. 3 minutes. The longest 3 minutes of my life. I stood clutching the plastic strip in my hands, afraid to look, afraid to see something that could change my reality once and for all. When I finally looked, 2 blue stripes clearly appeared in front of my eyes. I froze. Then I slowly sank to the floor, feeling all the emotions crashing down on me at once: joy, fear, grief, hope. They all mixed into one dizzying cocktail, filling every cell of my being. I'm pregnant. I'm carrying Michael's baby inside me. Her father's voice came from the other side of the door, full of concern. Is everything okay there? I opened the door, and the tears that I'd been trying to hold back up to that point were streaming down my face, spreading wet trails down my cheeks, mixing with the lump in my throat that I couldn't swallow. My father, who was standing in the hallway with an expression of concern, immediately noticed my condition. His face changed, anxiety overshadowed everything else. What's wrong, honey? What is it? He asked softly, taking a step toward me, as if ready to support me, to catch me if I suddenly lost my balance. I picked up the test with a trembling hand, still clutching it in my fingers, as if I was afraid it would disappear if I opened my palm. I'm pregnant, Dad. The words came out of my mouth almost in a whisper, but despite their barely audible volume, they scattered across the room, filling it completely, becoming something tangible, something that now existed outside of me. And at the same moment, I collapsed into his arms, sobbing, giving vent to the hurricane of emotions that had been raging in me from the very second I saw the 2 stripes. My father held me tightly, his strong, reliable arms squeezed me the way they used to when I was a child, when I came to him after nightmares, when life seemed simple and understandable, and his warmth was the only thing I needed to feel safe. It's okay, honey, he murmured, his voice hoarse but full of tenderness. Everything will be fine. You're not alone, Chloe. And this child is a gift, a piece of Michael that will live on. His words struck a chord with me. The child was a part of Michael. The continuation of our love. Suddenly, the fear that had been squeezing my heart began to recede, replaced by a fierce determination that I hadn't known I had before. You're right, I said, wiping my tears with the back of my hand. This child is a gift. And we'll be fine. Dad smiled, his eyes squinting at the corners, as they always did when he was pleased. That's my girl. Now let's make you something to eat. After all, you're eating for 2 now. I laughed through my tears, letting him put his arm around my shoulders and lead me to the kitchen. And with every step I took, hope blossomed in my chest. Time passed. My stomach was growing, and every day the maturing life inside me gave me powers I hadn't known existed before. My father was my rock, always by my side, sometimes with a kind word, sometimes with a cup of tea, sometimes with a gentle touch on my shoulder when I couldn't hold back my tears. We got used to the new routine, learned to live in this world where there were 2 of us now, but we were looking forward to the moment when there would be 3 of us. One afternoon, when I was tinkering in the garden that my dad and I were planting together, I heard a car pull up. My heart skipped a beat. I recognized this car. Karen's sedan. What could they possibly need this time? I stood up slowly, instinctively pressing my hand to my rounded stomach, as if protecting my child even before he was born. Karen and Emily were standing on our porch, their poses somehow strained, uncertain, their expressions both forced and desperate. "Chloe," Karen spoke first, and this time her voice was devoid of the sharpness, the sarcastic note with which she always addressed me. "We need to talk to you." I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, waiting for her to continue. Emily shifted from one foot to the other, her eyes darting nervously around the porch, as if she was looking for a way out of this situation. "We've been through difficult times," she finally murmured. "And we wanted to know if we could stay in your dad's old apartment. Until we get back on our feet." I was stunned. After everything they put us through. After their attempts to kick us out of the house. After they didn't even come to Michael's funeral. Did they dare to come ask for help? I took a deep breath, suppressing the first outburst of anger, and looked straight into Karen's eyes. "I'm sorry, but that's not possible," I said, my voice firm but calm. "I don't want to talk to you anymore." I saw Karen's eyes narrow, her shoulders tense, and her face harden. And suddenly her gaze fell on my stomach. I noticed how her expression changed, as a shocked realization flashed in her eyes. Are you pregnant?" She spat out, and there was something like disgust in her voice. "You little—" Karen stopped, unable to find the right words. Then she jerked her head up, her lips curling into a contemptuous smile. "I can't believe you've already found a new man." I flinched at her words, but quickly pulled myself together. "Michael's body wasn't even cold in the ground, and you—" She didn't finish, but the gist was clear. I felt a surge of anger, but I didn't let it take over. I didn't make excuses. She did not say that this child was Michael's child. I didn't want my child to have such a grandmother and aunt. Instead, I just smiled. Quietly. Calmly. Secretly. A smile that seemed to upset Karen even more. "My personal life is none of your business," I said calmly. "Now, I think it's time for you to leave." Karen opened her mouth as if she was about to throw another insult, but something in my gaze must have stopped her. She spun around, grabbed Emily's hand, and they hurried back to the car. I watched their sedan disappear around the corner, and a sense of peace came over me.